As retailers entered the lockdown in March 2020, a small, diverse group of Canadian thought leaders gathered to virtually speculate, collaborate, and share their insights on the waves of disruption facing retailers. The Business of Retail podcast emerged as an unflinching strategic alternative to the conventional discourse, revealing challenges in the headlines and exploring new, unconventional paths for all facets of the retail industry. Now, here's the panel.
Welcome to episode 31. This will be the last one for 2021, and we will hope everyone has a good holiday to come. Today, though, we're going to close out the year on a topic about people once again. A couple episodes back, we got into something that a lot of people are talking about in the news today, and that is the frontline challenges in retail with staffing, the shortages, the pressure the frontline workers are under. Much less discussed, and I think equally important, maybe even more so to the longevity of retail businesses, is the state of head office work in the retail sector in Canada. What are the retail professionals undergoing the last couple of years? Where is that headed? How is the whole talent discussion starting to get pulled apart and reconstituted? And that's what we're going to talk about today. Myself, David Ian Gray, we're joined by Craig Patterson, Christine Cowan, George Minikakis, and Gary Newbury. So let's pay a little acknowledgement to the fact that as much as there's been stress elsewhere around people and their workplace, that's obviously going to be true of people at head office and retail, and maybe with all the craziness between the supply chain issues and everything else going on and the closings and openings, maybe even harder on head office retail folks.
I've had many conversations over the last few months with people in the supply chain who realize it's come into prominence, but generally speaking, it's the thing that just gets on with the job. And the way of fixing it is just to run down into the warehouse and shout at somebody, and somehow miraculously it gets fixed. Now imagine trying to do that or managing that remotely, which many people have had to do during this period of time, having to adjust to that.
George, you've been in the driver's seat and you've seen everything from top to bottom. What would be maybe it's a loaded question, what would be the mood in the C-suite? Like, how are people burned out? What do you think people have gone through on a very human level?
Let me start by saying I think the retail world has gone from an analog world to a digital world, and whatever you want to make that to believe that is. The CEO today and senior executives are probably wondering, all right, like we said before, make the year. What's 2022 going to look like? But how is it going to look like organizationally to make sure that not just from a cost point of view, but from a performance point of view, how do you make that work? How do you reorganize it? I can't imagine someone, a large or mid-sized retailer not thinking about this. I think it's very important. And when you look at, operations, for example, you've got all these people working in the field, managing stores. Do you really need that structure anymore? The fact that you can Zoom and have a call with all your managers and a CEO can have a 15-minute discussion direct to people, the whole dynamic changes very quickly. So I think the ideas are rolling and that executives are starting to think more broadly, how do I make that transition from analog to completely digital? And I say analog because when we first got cell phones, they were analog. So there you have it.
George, there's going to be listeners who don't know what the word analog is, but we'll not worry about that today, will we?
Well, if they're under 25, maybe.
That's what I'm saying.
George, so I think what's really interesting is Dutra and how our retailers, US as an example, it's the US equivalent of MEC or MEC. And when the pandemic hit, they basically sold their headquarters. So they had a large headquarters in Seattle, sold it. Everyone went remote, other than staff obviously working in stores. And they have a couple satellite offices where executives and people can go in and meet and have time together. But for the most part, they've been remote. And think about the cost benefit of that. Think about the ability to attract talent from not only that area, but potentially globally. Definitely there's challenges, I think, with corporate culture, but they have a pretty strong culture. It's interesting, sitting in Portland, you've got a lot of the major brands like Nike, you've got Adidas, you've got Columbia Sportswear, huge headquarters, and people are still working remote. Now with this new variant, who knows when we're going to actually be able to get back into an office space. So how do you manage the camaraderie, the work, the team dynamics and everything else when you're working remote, but then still have to be energized and work together. And I think people are tired. I mean, I think we're all tired of the screen and we want that interaction again. We've been slowly sort of opening up. And now with this variant, I think it's going to be really scary to see what might be happening in the next 6, 9, 12 months.
We talked about the Great Resignation as it being a frontline worker issue. And albeit the head office, people are in career tracks, so maybe they're less likely to abandon their path. But I have to think it's happening there too. Is anyone hearing anything sort of from their network?
Yeah. From what I'm hearing, a lot of the resignation piece is just around people saying, look, what's my purpose now? What do I really want to do with my life? Am I happy doing what I'm doing? People are moving from cities out to rural areas. They have a better cost of living. They have a better lifestyle. Their kids can be around them more. In some cases, people are just making different decisions based on their family or based on what's acceptable for them in their work-life balance. And I think, that's another thing, being on screen all the time and being accountable all the time and meeting after meeting. I mean, it's hard enough being in an office, going to a meeting, but at least you've got space in between. You go get a glass of water, you have a chit chat, you've got time in between. And now it's just like you're constantly on screen. You've got another meeting, and trying to kind of keep up with that pace, I think, can be really challenging.
And Gary, we were talking a little bit offline about the pressures that are falling on certain functional areas disproportionately to change. Everyone's feeling it. But I wonder if that is also causing some tension inside organizations where maybe some people aren't up to the demands of real strategic shifts versus tinkering.
There's a couple of things that come to mind when you pose that question. One is that we've gone through a period which has been incredibly stressful and uncertain and ambiguous for so many people. They moved from being in the comfort of a communal area, an office, and they've been split out, served by technology into their homes, and they've got a whole range of other distractions associated with that. But suddenly they've all actually joined together on a purpose. They have to, for instance, get the shelves full or make sure that e-commerce site is up and running and working full speed. These are all quite tactical things. It almost plays to a sense of experience or training they've imbibed over a long period of time in their careers. The motivation at the moment for many organizations is not to continue to tinker. We've had 18 months, 20 months of this, and it could continue for a similar time. It's to actually have the strength to rethink what we're doing here. What is our actual purpose? What's our fundamental purpose? To wonder if we're skilled enough at doing that, and whether or not for Canadian executives, whether or not the ability to do work on a remote basis, and I think that we certainly talked about this offline, whether or not Canadian businesses, particularly retail business and brands, will actually start to look outside the kind of four walls of Canada or even the four walls of North America and actually look for European, Japanese, Chinese, whatever talent, and just go, do you know what? The Canadians that we've got, the North Americans that we've got, just can't shift the needle. We need to stop doing more of the same and actually find a new way of doing things. And that may require us to look outside.
There's a short-term win with that, but I fear for the long term, because what that says to me is throw out the window the idea of career pathing for young professionals coming up in Canada, especially if head offices are continuing to close post-holiday this year and are not getting replaced by new substantive head offices.
If you're talking career path, the opportunities in the US or globally can sometimes be a lot broader for people, and the succession up the ladder can be a lot quicker. And I'll speak for myself, having lived and worked and grown up in Canada and started my career there. I got to a point where in order for me to move my career forward, I had to move down to the US, the global headquarters. There's something great in the fact that I've lived and worked in Canada and I have an experience in Canada. So I bring that with me when we start talking about global businesses and educating people on the fact that Canada is different, and that there's nuances to Canada and what's important to that consumer that are different than the US consumer. So there's a bit of that, and I think it's being open-minded to having people leave and then potentially come back later in their careers where they've gained knowledge and experience that they can bring back into the country. I think it's been challenging. There's not a lot of Canadian brands that people can, especially in the retail space, that can offer that longevity of career. So I think that just that in itself can be a real challenge for young people as they're moving up the corporate ladder, and even for older executives. There's only so many places to go and so many things to do.
That's really interesting, actually, Christine, because I did a little bit of homework. I also called up Suzanne Sears, a well-known recruiter, and was asking about international retailers and how many of them have head office operations here in Canada. It's not looking good, let's put it that way. Certainly there are some international brands now, and the reason I'm picking international is because we have seen an incredible influx of international brands move into the country. I'd say over the past 6 to 7 years, at least since I've been tracking it, we're talking at least a couple of hundred. And now we've seen a situation where some have retracted, but some have also pulled back on leadership within their Canadian operations. And instead, some of these are being run internationally. There may be a person on the ground in Canada that's a manager. They may have an office in the back of a store, which I guess would be their flagship store, or at least head office back room store. The question is there a career path for Canadians in Canada with these retailers? Because Christine, you mentioned, you're in Portland, Oregon now, and from Vancouver. Before that, it's going to be an interesting time just to see where that goes, because that is a bit unfortunate in terms of where is our talent going to be going here. The other concern, again, is what we're talking about in terms of the work from home situation, because you don't have to live in a particular location to do something or run something. I think ultimately there is still going to be an importance for something tangible. I know that I relate better face-to-face for the most part with people, but I think we're going to get a lot more used to this. We're doing this digitally. None of us are obviously in the same room right now, or in the same city for that matter. So I think the future is going to be really, really interesting here.
I would not bank on any brands that are focused on selling pants, by the way, because I just think when you think about this, you just have your one pair, if that.
Pajama bottoms, maybe.
That's right. Well,
track pants, yeah.
George has always challenged me to try and be more provocative, so I got one for you guys. I had a conversation with someone at a major Canadian retail industry association a few years back, and I said, is the industry association about promoting the development and health of Canadian retail business headquartered here, homegrown, or is it about promoting and supporting operations from anywhere in the world that happen to sell and do business in Canada? And the answer was a little awkward, and it was like, sort of paraphrasing, I know what we'd want it to be and we know what it is. That is a concern I've had for a while, is that if we erode a nucleus of good corporate jobs where people can learn the ropes, I think that's harder to do on a learning curve remotely. Getting that mentorship and that nurturing might be tougher. From a CEO's perspective, does it matter? How important is it that we have this channel of new talent that's getting produced that is homegrown?
It's really important, but the first thought is, I think the education system, how many people go to a university to learn retailing? Well, if the marketplace starts shutting down and there's no home offices, there's just regional offices, Craig says at the back of a room of a store, what's the career path for a lot of these people, right? And then, or is there redundancy out of the education system in terms of what they're teaching at this point? I've asked that question many times, and you don't get a real clear answer. I do believe that those are barriers, and I agree that remote jobs will be challenging, but I think that the circle of people who will be upward mobile are going to be far more hands-on than they were in the past. They're going to be strategic, but they're also going to be very tactical. And I think that's where you're going to get your talent in the future. It's not just going to be the ones from the Ivy League school. That's not going to be reality anymore. You can't afford it, and retailers can't afford it.
Would it be opportune to say, whilst we've been training people in Canada going through Ryerson and schools of that ilk, and then developing their career in Canada, we've had this disruption, and now those same people could look at jobs across North America or across the globe, and it may actually indicate that our educational standards in retail are either very good and well known across the world and valued, which would leave people with, people coming up the ranks at the moment through the educational system will be tech savvy and will have already learnt Zoom and things like this as just the way that things are done. And would that give them greater adaptation to this world that we may be facing versus perhaps people who are not so comfortable with this technology and other technologies that are essential for retailing, who may actually be ending up in the backwater, which might be Canada, it might be another country, but they would naturally migrate to those situations that body of knowledge will find its home. David's quite pessimistic about what do we do to promote Canadian retail leaders in the future. I'm perhaps more optimistic. We may have Canadians who may be absolutely brilliant, but working abroad. I just think that's the natural consequences of the interdispersion of technology and knowledge, and now mobility that doesn't require us to move.
We may not get those people back though, and that may be the way it is, right? So I guess the question is, there's the normative what should be, and then what is. You just said something very interesting to me though, Gary, that I hadn't thought of, which is not just the geographic mobility, but the mobility across, say, the retail ecosystem. Because I know that Canada is well known globally for its real estate development as it relates to shopping centers in particular. So there's people from Ivanhoe and Cadillac Fairview who are peppered all over the Middle East and Asia because they were seeing world-class. Shane Eldstrom, who ran Mall of Dubai for a while and was doing all sorts of stuff there. So maybe part of it is being able to pull people from the shipping companies like FedEx and UPS, who may be based here, but pull them in for a stint. Maybe some people from real estate coming in. My concern, if I flip it around for a company, is the transfer of knowledge is super important. And if that transfer of knowledge keeps flowing outside, eventually we'll be, this is my pessimism, we'll be the home of branch offices. And when trouble hits, those companies will naturally hunker down and protect what's around them in their home market. And we've seen it happen, and the Canadian side will get closed. So I don't know what the ripple effect of that is, but I do think that could be a future state that's quite reasonable.
The one thing that I do think, though, helps from a Canadian perspective is back in the day, all the headquarters, all the action was happening in Toronto and Montreal. So you couldn't have a career in a lot of segments in Vancouver, Alberta, or Western Canada versus Eastern Canada. So now what it does, there's a lot more brands that are elevating in the Western part of the country and are doing well. But it also allows people that don't really want to move. I mean, back in the day, my dad was asked to go to the headquarters in Toronto. He didn't want to leave because of his family and our life in Vancouver. So opportunities back in those points in time, if you moved, you'd have the opportunity. If you didn't, you'd sort of be within the certain realm. Now you can go back and forth, whether you're physically there or not. So I think that does help, at least to some degree, keep some of the talent here. It's just, what are the companies? What is the mobility? What is the opportunity for people to grow and learn within a larger organization within Canada? And I think the longevity and some of the risk factor, again, just being around these companies and how they're going to evolve if they're more global companies versus Canadian companies.
And, I think that the process of managing and developing people is going to be the biggest obstacle for a lot of companies in the future. Because to your point, Christine, if you've got work from home and you've got all of the shifts that are happening, you've got employees, you're shrinking the home office, you've got less talent coming in because you've got technology working on your side. You're going to develop your people internally, but you're going to end up with a ton of competition for that talent to keep it. And that circle of available talent is going to be very narrow. And you're going to be watching people bouncing from one company to another in Canada or even in the US because of that short supply. Unless there's a venue for everyone to learn, or the dynamic of what you need to know by way of knowledge and skills to enter supply chain, to logistics side or merchandising or marketing. I mean, all of this is transforming in front of us. I think that will be the biggest challenge. How do you develop people and keep them?
As I think about what was being said here, is we need to question ourselves. What is the purpose of the head office or headquarters or home office? Because for the last 2 years, Many businesses have performed without them. It's just been maybe a $10 million rental thing, which we haven't really spent very much time. We've probably had to pay for somebody to go in and switch the lights on and off. But we've found a dynamic network through technology, through Zoom. We've probably stumbled into it a little bit, but maybe over the next year, we can get much better at this. And we need a much more systemic planning route to managing our businesses, which doesn't require physicality. We can get together once in a while. We need to find a way of building those cultural values which are important for us to succeed. I now question the purpose of a head office. And if people say, oh, so we can have some random conversations and kind of be creative, then I think, well, you need to look at your business model again. There's certain creative types that need lots of white space and lots of interaction. And maybe that's a personality type rather than a creative skill. The creative skill may be able to be programmed in somehow. We just need some more extroverted people, maybe I am, to actually make it come alive. I question the whole basis of a head office now. Maybe what has happened over the last, say, decade, maybe there's been a little glance into what might happen. All we needed was technology and a reason, the pandemic push, to actually start questioning the whole purpose of real estate, where lots of people go to hide. Because that's basically what a head office is. It's HQ, is hide quarters, because people do get lost in head offices.
It might be a Canadian Tire tent garage that it can hold 2 cars, and you put it in the back and you meet there once a week, with heaters and everything, especially if you're in Quebec or something. I'm with Gary, with everything that's happening today, the technology is there. Why?
I agree. I think these big global headquarters, just the cost, they're like museums, and people don't really want to go. There's definitely people that want to spend time there and go in, and there's the socialization part of it. But think about the cost savings of not having a headquarters and paying to house people. I have to believe that there's more effective ways to spend money on your talent and on the organization for future growth.
I'm going to be a little bit contrarian. There has to be significant hybridization, at least, where it's not just occasionally, like once a quarter, a meetup. And the reason I say that is at the level that we're all at, we've done a lot of our learning and now we're trying to apply it. But for the people that are mid-level and coming up the ladder, I can tell you I teach, and I've been teaching online and actually in person as well, starting again. The level of acceleration of the students when you can teach in person is much deeper, and it takes root much better than when you're trying to do it online. And I think part of that is developing trust and the social part of it, but learning isn't linear. It's not a binary on-off switch. And I worry about that. If everyone's in the same boat, if every company's going through the same thing, then there's no downside, I suppose. But if someone's sorting that out, your people may not be growing. There's a lot of really good ideas here. It's almost like a people disruption is what I'm hearing today, right? Supply chains got disrupted and digital disruption. This could be a people, how we organize the way we work, generally, but in retail in particular, is getting disrupted. And there's a lot of ideas. Is retail, as we know it in Canada, up for adopting even a portion of this, looking at different models? And I'm not so sure.
Back to your earlier point, though, you're always going to have interface, especially in a retail environment. You've got your leadership going in store, you'll have different touch points. And as you do strategy and plan, like most likely you'll have to have either like a WeWork situation where everybody comes in at different points in time to do it. I led a team in Japan remotely, and we were highly successful. We had moments in time. We got together strategically to work on the business. And then in between that time, and this was before we really had Zoom, we were on our iPhones having phone calls and connecting in. And so I think it can be done. I think you just have to build the team and build that trust in person, and then have your moments in time when you kind of go out and do things virtually.
Well, the flip side is if it's designed properly, the upside actually could be quite spectacular. I guess one thing we haven't touched on too much are the young brands that are coming up and knowledge transfers as they scale. One thing I've noticed is someone who's run something for years isn't always best suited to building something. They just know how something turns on and off.
We are seeing new brands coming up that could be quite successful from a retail standpoint. Even though we are seeing international brands looking at coming into the country, we're seeing a lot of smaller Canadian brands, which were primarily digitally native, or at least adopting some sort of a hybrid pop-up strategy, now actually looking at growing in the market, which I think is tremendous. We'll have a story on a brand called Sophie Grace out of Calgary doing women's career wear. One of many, many, many examples that I can think of. We've spoken about Emmy DeVoe and Edmonton's. These are just Alberta brands, but across the country we've got it. But I should say as well, I mean, I'm a director of, what was formerly just a retail school at the University of Alberta. Now it's about cities and communities, but retail is still there. You look at the largest retailers and who's doing business in Canada, lots of them are still Canadian, at least in the food area. We've got Loblaws as being a really, really, really big company. It's not all a loss in terms of international brands coming into the country with, say, career opportunities. Another story is, where are people from Loblaws headquarters working during the pandemic? Well, they may still be working in the office at some point. I've got a connection with Amazon, and I know they were looking at a 3-day week in the office, 2 days off, potentially for their employees, as well as a month a year that the employee could work remotely from anywhere within Canada. I think that's how it worked, probably for tax purposes, because I'd like to do it in the Caribbean about this time with the snow on the ground, but I'm sure we all would. But ultimately, you look back again, I mean, the big retailers in Canada, Walmart still has an office in Mississauga. It's not the Bentonville type of headquarters with everybody there at the very top, but it is still an office nevertheless. And I do believe, knowing some people at Walmart, that they are going into that office at least periodically. We'll see what happens with the most recent variant, but we do have big corporate offices in the country, or at least opportunities for people to grow still living in Canada. But this conversation really, I think, does bring up an important point, that we will see more remote work, and those Amazon employees are at some point probably going to demand being able to work a month out of the year in the Turks and Caicos. And I'd be right up there demanding that if I was an employee there. It would be absolutely wonderful. And I wish I could do this, and maybe next year I will.
Well, as we think toward our holiday break, that's a nice mental image. Hey, listen, thanks everyone. I think that was a nice closeout for the year. It brings the human element back into play. For the CEOs that are open to reimagining their people as much as they've been reimagining other parts of the business, there could be some really tremendous competitive advantages for the first movers on that. Happy holidays, Gary Newbury, George Minikakis, Christine Cowan, Craig Patterson, from me, David Ian Gray.
You have been listening to the Business of Retail podcast, an unflinching strategic alternative to the conventional industry discourse. Thank you for joining us. For more information, please go to www.thebusinessofretail.ca.